Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Clover Hogan. I am a 21-year-old climate activist. I research the psychology of agency, so understanding why we do or do not take action on the issues that we care about most deeply. And I'm also the founder and executive director of a social enterprise called Force of Nature. Started out at the UK and now an international organization where we support young people from all corners of the world to step up rather than shut down in the face of climate change. So that's really going to be the theme and topic of today. We're going to be together for about 20 minutes, unpacking our own psychology, looking at our mental and emotional landscapes in the context of climate change, and getting a little bit more clear on what's potentially stopping us from engaging in a more meaningful capacity with the issues. So please do have your Slido up so that you can input your responses and your answers, all that good stuff, and so I can hear from you guys directly. But otherwise, let's get right into it. So at Force of Nature, the problem that we really exist to take on is that of powerlessness. So as a student lobbyist and as a young climate activist, I had this kind of aha moment after a few years of taking action on the issues, where I realized that potentially the threat greater even than climate change, greater even than ecological breakdown, was just how powerless we felt in the face of these huge issues. And I realized that that powerlessness was, in the student activist groups that I was a part of. It was in the classroom. It was also in the boardroom, in places where big decisions were being made. And so I realized just how pervasive this was. And that's what really initiated and ignited my fascination with the idea of mindset and the role of mindset in being able to actually take on climate change. And to this day, I still think that mindset is perhaps both the most underutilized and also under talked about tool that we have in the fight on climate. So today we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into why it is that we do shut down in the face of climate change. What it is about our brains that are configured in a way that shuts us down, and what it is that we can do to kind of change that and shape how we respond to and how we think about the climate crisis. And so at this point, as we kind of check in on our feelings, I'd love to hear from you guys about, how climate change makes you feel. We're now a couple of days into the Youth Climate Summit, and I'd really appreciate, hearing what those emotions are that climate change has, invoked. It could be that you feel, paradoxical emotions. You could feel both despairing and hopeful at the same time. That's completely normal. But if you want to go ahead now and share how climate change makes you feel. And as you're doing that, I'm going to share a little bit more about some of the influences kind of out there that really impact our ability to show up in here. So at Force of Nature, we talk a lot about the idea of, outer activism versus inner activism. So outer activism being how we show up, and inner activism really being about, how we're checking in on ourselves and how we're making sure that the work that we do is both effective and fulfilling to take on the issues. And at Force of Nature, we've been researching this kind of psychology for the past year. I've personally been researching it for a few years, since the time I was 16 and wrote my thesis on this subject. And one thing that we've really seen a huge kind of spike in is eco-anxiety. So eco-anxiety is a term that you might all be familiar with now, but really relates to feelings of grief and overwhelm, frustration, anger, stress in the face of climate change. Research from Friends of the Earth last year showed that eco-anxiety was being experienced by up to 70, if not more, percent of 18 to 24-year-olds across the UK. And the same thing has been reflected in our research at Force of Nature. So we've conducted surveys with international students around the world, and they've shown us that over 70% of the young people we work with, before they go through one of our anxiety to agency classrooms, experiences eco-anxiety experiences feeling of hopelessness. At least 2/3 feel that climate change has a negative impact on their mental health. And so we've seen that there's this kind of silent epidemic of mental health problems created by climate change that aren't really being talked about. Close cousin to eco-anxiety is a term that maybe you haven't heard, which is ecophobia. And ecophobia relates specifically to that powerlessness that I referenced earlier. And why it's important to kind of draw a distinction and draw a line in the sand between these two terms is that, both of these responses are normal, right? Both of these responses are really human. And yet, climate psychologists would argue that eco-anxiety is indeed and in fact a healthy response to climate change. For a long time, I felt eco-anxious, and I thought that that was a sign of weakness. I thought that eco-anxiety was something I kind of had to beat into submission. And I then realized that, in fact, first, my eco-anxiety was inevitable, and it's what made me human, so I couldn't really squash it. And doing so, disallowing those feelings was really unhealthy. A lot of climate psychologists would argue that, the problem isn't that young people are feeling eco-anxious, but that more people should be feeling eco-anxious. Because it is a sign of empathy. It's a sign that you are alert to the issues, the fact that they wake something up within you. Whereas ecophobia is kind of what happens when we don't have a clear sense of here's what I can do as an individual, a clear path of agency. That ecophobia comes when, the problem feels so insurmountable that we kind of feel this paralysis in the face of it. And so at Force of Nature, what we try to do is support young people to really come into awareness and befriend the feelings that are inevitable to come up within the face of climate change, and then really shape their container of agency, so that they have a clear sense of what they can actually do to take on these challenges. So I just have a few of those responses coming in now. Overwhelmed, but also have faith, inspired by the beauty of the world, hopeful, amazing. Motivated, that's awesome. And do you know what? There's quite an interesting contrast as well. We did the same session at the start of the week, where we talked about our feelings. And in fact, majorly the emotions that came up were, anxiety and overwhelm and fear. And so I wonder if it isn't testament to this Youth Climate Summit that we're all feeling a bit more hopeful. I know I certainly am as well after the election on the weekend. So that's awesome. Thank you guys for sharing. So to continue, really the key then is how do we harness the emotions that are inevitable to surface in the face of climate change? And how do we carry forward the ones that are really helpful to us? And how do we leave behind the ones that keep us feeling stuck? But before we can really dive into that, it's helpful to understand what's happening on a psychological level. So what's happening within our own brains in the context of climate change? And to understand that, we're going to do a quick psychology 101 in ecophobia, so in that feeling of powerlessness, and then we'll do more self-reflection on our own psychology and our own sense of agency. So the first kind of bucket that we've identified of why it is that we feel so powerless as agents of change, and why it is more broadly that climate change is such a difficult challenge to take action on, relates to human psychology. That might seem obvious, but specifically, how we're kind of hardwired. We humans are wired to respond to sudden intimate attacks. For our ancestors, when a saber-toothed tiger kind of leapt at us from the bush, or for me today in London, when someone swerves toward me on an e-scooter on the pavement. So we humans are wired to kind of fight or flight. And in the context of climate change, that kind of turns into freeze, or worse, fatalistic acceptance. So a lot of climate psychologists have described this as the kind of frog in a pot of boiling water. So if a frog were to jump in a pot of boiling water, it would immediately try to jump out again, right? But when the change is incremental, when the frog jumps into a pot that is kind of lukewarm, but doesn't realize that it's swimming above a flame, and as that water gets warmer and warmer and warmer, the frog doesn't jump out until it's too late, until that water is boiling. And climate change is analogous to this. It's happening, it's here, and yet it's so large and so slow moving that we're kind of sleepwalking toward this cliff edge. And so, where it's really helpful to understand that, it isn't an issue that ignites emergency within us. Fortunately, the climate science, which is now largely mainstream, has made clear to us just how much of an emergency situation we're in. And we're able to overcome some of that hard wiring to appreciate the urgency of this issue when we're told that we have just 10 years to change so much of how we live, breathe, and exist in the 21st century, recognizing that climate change, for those of us who live in a bubble of climate privilege, is still something that we kind of read about rather than something that we're experiencing more directly. Although that's obviously not the case for lots of people around the world. Frontline communities, such as those in Mumbai who are experiencing terrible air pollution, or kids in the Maldives who have lost their homes already to rising sea levels. Indigenous tribes in the Amazon who've been, fighting this fight and arguably experiencing that eco-anxiety for many more years than has been in our kind of conscience and in the quote unquote global south, or global north rather, or Western world. And so that kind of relates to some of that psychology. And then the other thing worth noting here is that of optimism bias. So this is less relevant for young people whose powerlessness often shows up in kind of despair and fatalism. But if you look at the other end of the generational spectrum, so folks of my parents' age, you see denial show up in a different way. So not in terms of, climate change isn't happening, it's not real, or that's certainly a small minority, but more so this kind of techno-utopianism, this idea that miraculously robots will save the day, or, kids will step up to the challenge, or, I think this really relates to the fact that it's very difficult to anticipate a threat that you haven't yet experienced. And so it's easy for us, for example, to, as a collective, look retrospectively and say, oh yeah, we could see this coronavirus thing happening, right? We've now experienced it, we've lived it. And it's really difficult to do the same with something like climate change, which is still so kind of nebulous and overwhelming. And so we see that generational kind of rift where lots of young people are really shutting down, and lots of older generations are kind of performing mental gymnastics to make sense of the situation by blindly hoping that everything will be fine. And so neither of these responses are particularly helpful, neither blind faith nor blind despair are really going to get us out of this mess. It's about holding tension between those two, which we'll get into. And which I also saw in your responses, it's totally normal to feel scared but hopeful, right? And the idea there isn't to try and disallow those feelings or swap one with another. It's how to actually create space for both of them within yourself and have that depth and complexity to navigate these really uncertain times. So the second bucket, so the first bucket relates to human psychology and how we're wired from an evolutionary perspective. The second bucket really relates to cultural narratives. So the stories that we kind of subscribe to about the world, of fictions that keep us feeling disempowered. Now, cultural narratives are really interesting because they illuminate the systems that climate change shows us are super broken. And yet we often don't interpret them as fiction. So we kind of interpret them as gospel, or this is just how things have always been done. But we can think about these cultural narratives as fitting into two kind of brackets of values. So we have extrinsic values and we have intrinsic values. So extrinsic values relate to things like consumption, comparison culture, competition, all of the values that kind of distract us from what matters and distract us from following our kind of North Star, or that personal internal values compass. They're kind of the values that are pushed upon us by society as it's currently configured. Whereas intrinsic values relate to really values like contribution, connection, community. So anything that helps you connect to being of service, both to yourself and to other people. And we can see how there are clear influences, especially on young people, that distract us from these intrinsic values. Social media, for example, really peddles and perpetuates this kind of comparison culture where I'm constantly comparing myself to other people who are smarter or prettier or funnier. And I'm then being told by advertisers that I can feel good enough so long as I buy this thing or I attain this thing in my life. So it's constantly looking outside of ourselves for that kind of fulfillment. And this also relates to living in a kind of hyper globalist consumptive society. We young people have inherited systems that have kind of been built off a centuries long history of the commodification of nature. So really exploiting nature and a society that values a tree more when it's dead than when it's alive. And we can't underestimate the impact that this has on our sense of self and our mental well-being, as we're kind of raised to love nature while also becoming complicit in its destruction. And that's a really hard pill to swallow, especially as a climate activist or just as someone who cares passionately about climate change. By the nature of how we live, by the nature of the food in my fridge, the clothes on my back, how I get around the city, I am the reason climate change exists. I'm contributing to climate change, not as much as the chief executive whose decisions equate many millions of individuals, but I still know that I'm complicit. I know that I'm part of that problem. And so that relates to how some of the cultural kind of narrative that we've inherited determines our ability to kind of show up and feel like empowered agents of change. And then finally, we have our self-limiting beliefs or our stories. And these relate to the stories that we subscribe to about ourselves that determine how we're able to show up. So these stories include things like, I'm not smart enough or experienced enough to solve these problems. I don't know where to start. The one that I hear most commonly is, the system is too broken to create meaningful change. And so what I'd love us to do now is actually reflect on what some of those stories are for ourselves. So I want you to go ahead and think, what is the story that I subscribe to? And there might be lots of them, but what is the story I hold about myself that gets in the way of me taking action? And I'd like you to take about 30 seconds to reflect on that question while I take a glass of water. And as you reflect on that question, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and actually share that in the chat box as well. My second question to you is to identify what you would need to do to challenge this story. So what's one thing that you would need to make happen to reveal this story for what it is? So what would change the story? And I don't want you to think necessarily about, things outside of your control, some decision being made or some election or, something that's kind of out there. But again, back to this idea of mindset, what would you need to do to challenge that story? Examples would be, if your story is that you're not smart enough or experienced enough, something I hear working with so many young people who are incredibly capable and switched on, is to understand what skills you do have that you can use to create change. If your story is that the system is too broken to create meaningful change, potentially the evidence that you need to challenge this story is to reframe climate change as an opportunity to create a better world and to focus on which solutions do exist rather than giving all of your energy to the problems. If your story, as a final example, is that you don't know where to start, then potentially the thing that you do to challenge this story is find the focus of a single problem rather than feel overwhelmed by the scale of climate change. So going forward today at the Youth Climate Summit, I really want you to continue reflecting on these couple of questions. What is the story that's getting in the way of your meaningful engagement with the issue? And what can you actually do to begin to challenge this story? And start setting goals for yourself as well. You know, if you want to understand what skills you have to create change, think about what it would look like to list out your top skills and how they might relate to solving a problem that you really care about. So continue stepping up, continue to analyze what's kind of going on in your own mindset. And as you do so, continue to reflect on this idea that, you know, we aren't going to really think our way into new ways of acting. We're only going to be able to act our way into new ways of thinking. And it's clear that we need a revolution in how we think about climate change and how we think about ourselves in the context of it. So I really encourage you to start taking those first steps, because when you take those first steps, you gain momentum and your activism snowballs. So it's simply a matter of initiating that, launching yourself into it, and really reflecting on which stories you hold about yourself and about the world that either help you or disempower you. So that's going to bring an end and a close to today's opening session for Anxiety to Agency, which we've been running every day this week and will continue to do so tomorrow and next day. In the meantime, I hope you have an amazing end to the summit and really, really enjoy your time. You connect with lots of young-minded people, and I really hope that you also reach out to us. You can find me at Clover Hogan on all of the platforms. You can find at forceofnature.xyz on all of the platforms too, also by giving us a Google. Please do reach out. Feel free to sign up for one of our Anxiety to Agency classrooms, which is a 90-minute deep dive into just a flavor of what we've touched on today. And make sure to also keep an eye open for Friday's session, which is 40 minutes, entitled Everyone's an Activist, where we'll be unpacking this much more deeply. So thank you guys so much for joining, and look forward to seeing you then. Bye.